So this is the new Suunto Race 2, so this is the follow-up to the original race, which made a pretty big splash for being a full-on multi-sport watch with premium materials and tons of features for the money, but there was always one thing holding it back. So with the follow-up here with the Race 2, so there's some nice refinements all around, like it's thinner and lighter, the display is bigger and brighter, and there's also longer battery life, but they also made a big upgrade when it comes to the heart rate sensor. Is it actually more accurate though? Well, I've got plenty of examples for you here where I tested it for lots of different kinds of activities, including running, cycling, as well as high intensity interval training and weight training, just to see if they finally solved heart rate accuracy. And of course, I'll also be covering all the other aspects like health feedback, training feedback, as well as GPS accuracy. And I was even able to test it out recently in New York City, which can always be a fun test to see how watches perform. And if you do happen to find the information in this video to be useful, just do me a favor and hit that like button when you get a chance. It's a small thing that you can do that'll help this video and the channel out quite a bit, and I appreciate it. And one more quick note before we get into the video is that you may see a little bit of flickering or banding on the display on some of the clips, but that's just the refresh rate of my camera not matching the refresh rate of the watch. You don't see that in real life. So first up, let's talk about price and options. So the new Race 2 comes in two different versions. So there's a stainless steel version for $499 and then a titanium version for $599. And then for hardware and materials, so these still have a 49mm case diameter, but they're now thinner and lighter at around 6% thinner, and then for weight, the stainless steel version has dropped to 76 grams and the titanium version now is 65 grams. So they're able to shave off a few grams of both of them. And another made they changed was on the lug design, where you'll notice that the lugs now lay a lot flatter than before. And this should probably help for those of you with larger wrists, where these new lugs shouldn't dig into your wrist. And then when it comes to design, so the original Race may actually be one of my favorite watches ever when it comes to sport watch design. I just love the angles that they chose. The ridges on the bezel were kind of like subtle and added a nice bit of texture, and it was a nice blend of classy and industrial. Now with the Race 2, it shares the same familiar lines, but they've gone away from the ridges on the bezel that were found on the original Race, which I have to admit I'm a little bit bummed about, but don't get me wrong, I think this still is a stunner of a watch, but it's certainly more on the clean end of things now and has a less industrial feel to it. And the design is actually probably more in line with the Race S, where this new Race 2 very much just looks like a larger version of the Race S. And then for the strap, so it comes with this new two-toned watch strap, which is kind of a nice touch, and this is a 22mm standard interface here, so you can go and switch this out for plenty of different options out there. Interestingly though, I sort of like the strap on the original Race quite a bit because it was like nice and soft and stretchy. And interestingly, I didn't necessarily like the watch strap on the Race S, which I thought was kind of like stiff. But this strap on the Race 2, so this kind of like splits that difference. But when it comes to overall comfort, so I really appreciate that thinner case. So it definitely helps with keeping the center of gravity lower on the watch so it doesn't bounce around on the wrist as much, which can definitely be important during sports. But that thinner case is also nicer in just like everyday use, where it's just easier to get sleeves over the watch. And the dimensions that they list on their specs for the case thickness don't actually include the heart rate sensor, which is important to factor in. And funny enough, they probably should have actually factored that in, considering that the new heart rate sensor lays a lot more flush with the case, where the previous heart rate sensor stuck out quite a bit more. And then for the display, so this gets a bump in size, where this is now 1.5 inches versus 1.43 inches from before. And since this is the same case size, that means that the bezels are now thinner, where the gap from the outside of the case to the display itself has been reduced. It is, however, still running the same 466 by 466 pixel resolution as before, so you're getting a larger display but not necessarily more pixels. But honestly, this is a super crispy display still, and I think it would be kind of hard to see the difference when it comes to actual pixel density. Now another change they made, which I think makes a big difference, is that they've also made a bump in the display brightness, where this new display panel has a peak brightness of 2000 nits versus 600 nits from before, and this is definitely noticeable. Now I didn't necessarily have any issues with the original Race, where it performed well for me, but this new display is incredibly easy to see even in direct sunlight. And another new thing with its display is that this now has LTPO technology. So what this allows it to do is dynamically adjust the refresh rate in an aim to save on battery life, where it can go up to 60 Hz for the best performance, but lower based on conditions. And then to get around the device, so the Race 2 shares the same familiar interface as the original, where this uses a combination of a touchscreen along with 3 physical buttons, with one of those buttons acting as a digital dial. So if we scroll up at the bottom, so these are going to be your widgets, which show different kinds of information like notifications, the weather, steps, as well as sleep. So if we just go ahead and tap on sleep here, so we can just enter this widget where there's just going to be more details, and then to go back a screen, we can either swipe to the right, or alternatively, we can also use the lower right-hand button. And then if we swipe down from the top, so here here's all the sport profiles that are loaded onto the watch, and the list is pretty vast here, and we'll definitely get into more details on these here in a bit. Now, if we press the upper right-hand button though from the watch face, so this brings up the last sport profile that we used, and in this case for me, this was the trekking profile. And then to start an activity, we just press the middle button on the right-hand side, and then away we go. And then once you're in an activity, to scroll through data pages, you can press the middle right-hand button to go through all the pages that you have set up, including the map page if it's an outdoor activity. And then if you want to register a lap, so you'll press the lower right-hand button to do that, and then to pause and save your activity, you'll press the upper right-hand button, and then you can either save or discard your activity from there. So those are more the basic functions, but there's also some additional things that you can do. So if you swipe to the left from the watch face, so this is what they call a pinned widget. So this allows you to pin one of your favorite widgets that you can quickly access by either swiping to the left, or alternatively, you can also see this widget by pressing the middle right-hand button from the watch face. Now, if you press the lower right-hand button from the watch face, so here's where we can access the control panel. So these are more like utility-like functions that you may want to access, like the alarm clock, the flashlight, as well as the do not disturb feature. If you want to get into more system-wide settings, so you'll do that by just long pressing the middle right-hand button. So here's where you can access all the settings like display settings and such, but this is also where you can customize the pinned widget as well as some additional button shortcuts. So if we want to customize the pinned widget that we can access quickly from the watch face, so here's all the different widgets that you can actually pin here. But there's also two more shortcuts that we can set up for the upper and lower buttons here. So if we go back into the settings again, then go down to customize and then scroll down, here's where we can see customize the long press of the upper and lower button. So here's where we can access more of those utility-like functions that we may want to quickly access. So for me, I tend to like assigning the upper right-hand button to the built-in display flashlight, and then I like the lower button set to a do not disturb feature. Now, another initial complaint with the original race was the interface speed, where there was a bit of lag there. Now, they did actually improve this though with the original with a software update, which definitely helped things quite a bit. But the new race 2, so they're now using a new processor that has twice the speed, and you can just whip around this interface super quick, and there's basically like no delay here. The only thing I still sort of notice is just a little bit of a delay, and I'm just talking about a tiny delay when I go to start an activity. But I'd also have to say that some other watches do have this sort of like momentary lag as well when starting an activity. And then for storage, so now both the stainless steel and the titanium versions get 32 gigabytes versus the original race, which had 16 gigabytes for the stainless steel and then 32 gigabytes for the titanium. And that storage, by the way, is meant for maps and routes, but unfortunately there's no onboard storage for music or music playback capabilities for that matter. However, you do have media controls where you control the music playback on your phone if your phone is connected and in range. And then when it comes to battery life, so they made some improvements here as well, where they advertise up to 18 days of battery life if you're using it just as a smartwatch, which is up from the 16 days from before. Now, battery life is going to depend on a lot of factors, like if you choose to use the always-on display, display brightness, sleep tracking, as well as how many outdoor activities that you track. And for me and how I've been using it, so I've been primarily using it with its always-on display configuration. I had it on medium brightness. I was tracking sleep along with blood oxygen and HRV, and I've probably been averaging a bit over 2 hours of outdoor activities per day, and I'm trending around that like 7 to 10 day mark depending on the week, which is pretty good considering that many outdoor activities. And then when it comes specifically for tracking outdoor activities, so this also gets a slight bump as well, and that's mainly going to be in the most accurate dual band mode. Now again, battery life is going to be highly dependent on the settings that you use, as well as how much you interact with your watch during your activity. And for my test, that 55-hour mark is probably the best case scenario if you're not using the always-on display and you have it set to the lowest brightness and you're not likely interacting with your watch at all during your activity. But I think more like middle of the road settings with using the always-on display with medium brightness, that was more like 30 hours. But again, it can go up or down depending on what you're doing. And another thing to note about battery life is that sleep tracking, SpO2 tracking, as well as heart rate variability were not on by default, at least on my watch. So make sure to check that if you do want to track your sleep and other recovery metrics. And then another change they made on the battery side of things is the Race 2 comes with a new, very welcome new charging cable and magnetic connector, which solves an issue that they had with the old connector, where with the old one, you kind of had to get the contact pins just right or it wouldn't charge. With this new connector, they have it so there's really not that much chance of that happening, and you can pretty much get it secure. And then for health features, so this can track your heart rate 24 hours a day. It will also keep track of your resting heart rate. And by the way, this little gap right here that you see is when I took off the watch for a little bit. It can also track your steps throughout the day, and it can also track your calories burned. And then it also has a metric called resources. So this is supposed to give you an indication of your current energy level at a given point. So like here at the end of my day, you can see I had more resources or energy during sleep, and then I depleted that with the workouts I did throughout the day. And then for sleep tracking, so it'll track your sleep duration, and it'll also give you a score to kind of reflect your sleep quality. It'll track your heart rate throughout the night, and then it'll also track your sleep stages and also track your blood oxygen saturation levels if you have that set up to track. Now, I don't usually dive super deep into sleep stage accuracy all that much, as that it can be even hard to track even with medical grade equipment, so it can be a little bit nebulous there. However, I do have to say that their estimate for deep sleep seems to be a little bit ambitious, at least compared to some other trackers that I use. However, I do have to say that our sleep score does seem to line up with how I actually feel in the morning. And then along with that, it can also track your HRV or heart rate variability over time, and it also can provide a baseline range for you based on your sleep history, and also give you indication if you're within range or out of range, which can be good indicators of recovery as well as just like general health. And speaking of recovery, it can also provide a recovery index. So this is going to be a little bit different than the resources metric that we saw before, where resources is more about general daily energy levels, where recovery is more related to training, as in how well you recovered from previous training, and this is based on your recent HRV, your recent sleep history over the last 7 days, as well as your TSB or training stress balance. And you also get additional training feedback, like being able to see your TSS or training stress score. So this shows my training load over the last week. So this is basically that same acute training load number that was referenced in the training stress balance widget from before. And here you can see those actual numbers now. So the CTL figure here on the left is my average daily training load from the last 42 days. And then that ATL figure in the center is my current daily average training load from the last week. And then on the right is the correlation between the two. And then you also have a progress widget. So progress is going to be more about how productive you are, as well as provide more performance related metrics. So first off, it provides a ramp rate, or basically if the amount of chronic training load has been either increasing or decreasing over time. And right now, since I've been doing a lot of training over the last 7 days compared to the last 42 days, it shows that my ramp rate has been increasing and productive. And it can also provide other performance related stats here, like a running VO2 max, as well as a race time predictor for common running race distances. And while the running VO2 max seems to be pretty in line with most of my other recent VO2 max tests, as well as some other wearables, the race estimates are pretty aggressive estimates considering my current running volume. Now, when it comes to training stress balance, chronic training load, acute training load, and all these other terms and metrics, so these are all standard terms based on training peaks concepts. So these aren't anything new or anything like that, and are used by a lot of athletes. But I'd also say that the way that these are represented don't seem to be super relatable, and maybe hard to understand what they may mean if you're not familiar with these terms. So I think there could be a little bit of improvement here in terms of making these figures a bit more friendly for a wider audience who may not be familiar with these terms. And then when it comes to what kinds of sports that you can track, so this has pretty much every sport profile imaginable and more than 115 modes to choose from, so a ton. So I think some highlights here, other than the standard running, cycling, and gym profiles, is that they have both pool swimming as well as open water swimming. It can also track triathlon, but then there's a boatload of others like racket sports, team sports, and countless others, including, yes, tracking your chores. Something I probably need to get to, actually. And the only things this watch doesn't really have are going to be like dive profiles for scuba diving, but this watch isn't necessarily a dive capable watch either, like some of Suunto's other watches. However, this watch does come with a snorkeling and mermaiding profile. And another thing they've finally done with the Race 2 is that it can now actually pair to multiple sensors of the same type. So what I mean by this is that you could previously pair, let's say, a heart rate sensor as well as a power meter at the same time. But if you happen to have, let's say, more than one heart rate monitor, you can only pair one of those with the device. And I'm not necessarily talking about using 2 heart rate monitors at the same time. I mean that if you had one paired with the watch before, to use a different strap, I'd have to replace the other strap that was paired with my watch with the new one. Now you can actually have more than one sensor of the same type paired, so you can seamlessly switch between sensors depending on your activity. The Race 2 also comes with offline topo maps that you can use to help give context of your location. So in addition to seeing the path that you've actually taken with a breadcrumb trail, these maps allow you to understand a bit more of what's going around you, like streets, trails, and other landmarks. And these also do include topographic information for understanding elevation changes around you. Now, a couple things to note about these particular maps is that these don't currently contain any labels for any streets, trails, or landmarks. And another thing is that these are map images, meaning that you can see what's around you, like there's a trail over there or there's a street over here, but these aren't fully routable maps, meaning that you can't choose a location on the map to have the watch guide you with turn-by-turn directions on how to actually get there. However, you can use preloaded routes for navigation. So here's where you can either build a route in the Suunto app, or you can actually import a route file if you'd like. So this is where you'll get additional context during your outdoor activity to make sure that you're actually on the intended path. And then on top of that, they also have a specific feature for climbs in a sense where when you load in a route, it can provide an elevation profile of your route just so you can kind of understand how much suffering that you have left. And I do have to say with the new coloring that they've added here, it really helps differentiate grades really well. And you can also now add waypoints to your climb. So where this could come in handy is, let's say there's like a water stop or a rest stop midway up your climb. So what you can do here is add a waypoint to your route in the Suunto app, and this will actually break that out as a separate climb on the climb guidance screen. So what you'll do is actually scroll down from the main climb guidance screen to any climbs that you actually have broken out with waypoints. So this is basically just kind of like a zoomed in view of those particular climbs versus the entire route. And then on the GPS side of things, so the Race 2 has a dual frequency or dual band GNSS chipset just like before, and Suunto watches have always performed pretty well for me, and the Race 2 was pretty good here as well. And accuracy is both for the tracks themselves, as in following the actual path that you've taken, but that also translates directly into the total distance for activities. And for the total distance, that always lined up pretty darn well with all the other devices. Really solid nut front, and we're talking about tons of tests that I did with it. Now for the tracks themselves, so these are also pretty good here as well. Like on all these rides and runs here, it held a solid line on all the straight sections and also performed really well on corners and curves. Nice and tight tracks all around. Now those activities though were out in the wide open where there's not really many challenges for a watch to deal with, like any objects interfering with the satellite signal. But now let's take a look at some harder tests I have for both a trail run as well as a run through New York City. Okay, so for this trail run here, so this trail has a pretty good amount of tree cover and also skirts some taller rock faces at times, and it also has a lot of switchbacks, so it's always a good test for accuracy. As we head up the trail, all good to go, no issues that I could see, and it was following along the path that I was taking pretty darn well. And then as I headed down, it looked pretty good here as well, but maybe overshot this corner a little bit right here, and then maybe it was a little bit off right here, but all in all, very solid stuff out of the Race 2, at least for this trail. Now for the run I did in New York City, so this is arguably one of the hardest tests for a watch to deal with just because of all the tall buildings. But as we start out, well, that's not necessarily a great start, unfortunately, for the Race 2 where it was offset and thought I was on the other side of the street. But after a few blocks though, it did get back on track, but then after that, it may have seemed like an ice cream cart on the other side of the street or something like that and decided to take a look. And then as we start to enter Central Park here, so this roundabout right here was kind of like out in the wide open, so I was a little bit surprised to see it off right there. However, as we go through the park, it was good to go. And then on the second half of the run as we headed back, so it was good for a while, but then it did hop back onto the other side of the street again, and then as we ended in Times Square, it was in line there. So it wasn't quite as accurate as the other devices I was using, at least through New York City. On all the other tests, it did a fantastic job and was a solid performer, but for the most challenging test of all, I wouldn't say it necessarily failed by any means, but the other devices I was using laid down some cleaner tracks. And I also wanted to talk about the barometric altimeter accuracy, and on a few rides, it was right in line with other known good devices, as well as a reference source, which in this case was Strava's corrected elevation figure, which is based off of their base maps. However, I'd have to say on probably the majority of my rides, the elevation gain reported was always generally higher than all the other sources, and this wasn't a base elevation issue either when it comes to first calibrating elevation to GPS data. There was just some drift that I saw over the course of some activities. But arguably the biggest upgrade that they did on the Race 2 is the new heart rate sensor. And like I was mentioning earlier, it was the one thing that always kind of held me back from recommending the original Race or the Race S for that matter. Like both those, fantastic watches and a really good price as well, but you just got to go ahead and use an external heart rate monitor. But with the Race 2, so this has a completely redesigned heart rate sensor, which basically its number one thing in life to do is deliver more accurate heart rate. So let's see how it does. So as usual, I started with indoor cycling, which I use as a baseline with any watch. Pretty much all watches get this right, and with the Race 2, really good job all around for the most part. Like on this ride, nearly perfect actually, and then on this ride here, a few little blips and bobbles here or there, and then on this ride, just a little bit of shakiness at the end, but taking it outside, so this is where we start to throw more variables into the mix, like bumps and vibrations from the road. And in my case, the majority of riding that I do is on gravel, which can make watches bounce around a bit more. But the Race 2 handled this pretty darn well, and on some rides, very good in fact, but I did also have some rougher gravel rides where I saw it get thrown off from time to time. Still though, for the majority of my rides, and I rode a lot with this thing, it's overall delivering some pretty decent accuracy for the most part, and far, far better than what I ever got out of the Race or the Race S for that matter. And then when it comes to running, pretty decent on this steady state run, where other than this portion right here in the middle where we're at a few beats per minute low, but did a really good job. However, on this run here, so it looks to me that it may have been caught in a little bit of a cadence lock right here on the beginning portions and possibly even right here. However, did actually do pretty okay on these stop and goes at the end. However, I do have to say that I'm pretty impressed from the results on this trail run, where this is a really good result for trail running, so good job there. Now for the hardest test of all, so that's going to be weight training as well as high intensity interval training, and these are activities that are tough for watches watches to get right based on the location of the heart rate sensor. With these kinds of activities, we're doing a lot of gripping onto dumbbells as well as a lot of varying arm movement, which is basically the worst scenario for these kinds of sensors. So it's really just kind of a bonus if a watch can get this right. And I have to say that I think the Race 2 may actually get a bonus here, because this isn't bad at all when it comes to these kinds of activities. Like on these chest presses at the beginning, quite good. And then on these shoulder presses right here, quite good as well. Now on these two sets of chest flies right here, it definitely did read a bit high, but it did okay on the rest. And then for the intervals at the end, it was a bit slower reacting to the rapid changes in the heart rate, but you can see that it did follow along the trends pretty well. So I think the Race 2 is going to be a big win for Suunto, and I think they finally also solved that heart rate accuracy issue with this new sensor, but there's also some other just nice upgrades all around that they've done here. And the price definitely isn't as aggressive as the original Race, but they also have made some meaningful upgrades here, especially on the heart rate side of things, which not only means more accurate data, but also means more meaningful health and training feedback. Anyhow, if you found the information in this video to be useful, do me a favor and just hit that like button down below, and also be on the lookout for tons more sports tech videos that are coming up soon. But in the meantime, have fun out there, and we will see you in the next video.